My experience with the ESO get me more familiar with what was going on in Italy. And one day I was out here in Los Angeles. I believe it was over on Slauson Avenue someplace. I was driving along and I spotted a car at a repair shop along the highway that caught my eye. And so I turned around and went in and to find out, well, what is this thing? And it was a Ferrari 250 Berlinetta Lusso. And I'm very impressed by its appearance. And as a result of that, again, I went to the Los Angeles Times and looked in the auto section, and there was one listed for sale. It was up in Pasadena, and Asa Clark had been president of the Ferrari Club, and he had it and a 275 GTS. And so I went up to take a look at the Lusso, and he said, "You'd have either one of them." Well, I was more interested in the Lusso, although that GTS, the 275 GTS, was a very nice car, probably a better car, but I was more interested in the Lusso. And again, no negotiation. I said, "I'll take it." And so it had been well used, but what did I know? I just bought it. But I took a trip to Italy, because I'd been to Italy, 2 or 3 times for the ESO. And so I just showed up there in Maranello, and the idea was to get a lot of the emblems and rubber and everything it would take to make that car nice. So I returned from that trip, and my friend, Pete Savati, said, if you're gonna fix up a car nice, maybe you should start on a little higher level. And he told me about a friend of his, or someone he knew in Fort Collins, Colorado, that had one. And at the time, I was flying a flight that had a layover in Denver. So I went up to take a look at it, and it was a pretty nice car. It was nicer than the one I had. And a little more money. It was $7,500 now. So again, I decided, I bought it. I came back a week or so later and drove it back to Los Angeles. And that was my first long trip in a Ferrari, and it was enjoyable until I got in the middle of the desert out by Kingman, Arizona, or somewhere in that area. And it was getting so bad that when I got to Blythe, I had to stop. I went into there was a bar there, and I went in there and drank iced tea till the sun went down before I'd attempt to get back on the road again. I got that car back, and I lived with it for a few months, and again decided to schedule another trip to Italy. Now I'd take an inventory, see what I would need to make it a nice car. It's like going fishing. You dig around in a parts bin, you don't know what you're going to find. And they were really good to me. They allowed me to go back in the parts bin. At one point, I was on the roof at Scaglietti, where they stored windshields, and I pretty much had a free run of the place. The production line was, they were building 246 Dinos, and I remember just inside the door was the trim shop. And I went in and I got some scraps of trim, and I got the trim samples and paint samples.
Was the door open for you to do the same at Ferrari for more of the engine mechanical parts?
Well, they had a customer area there. It was right outside the door of Enzo's office. There were 2 or 3 little cubicles. They're only about 8 feet square, and there's nothing in there but a table and a chair. And I was sitting there waiting for somebody, and I looked up, and there was Enzo standing right outside the door with another fellow. And so I stood up, and I walked over and sort of introduced myself and shook hands with him. And of course, there was no real conversation, and I had my camera lying on the table there, and I never even thought to take a picture or ask anybody to take a picture. But that's as close as I ever came to Ferrari. Well, that's pretty close, I guess, if you shake hands, but it wasn't much of an interaction. And when I returned from that trip, I got my mail, and I was in the Ferrari Owners Club at the time, and there was an ad. And the ad said, "For sale, Berlinetta Lusso, not like the one in the Road and Track article, but the one, $10,000. So I had always intended to go and see that car because it was generally considered to be the nicest one around. So I took that opportunity to go down and take a look at it. And when I took a look, I said, well, this is what I'm trying to do with these other two cars. And here's the car it's complete, it's as nice as it can get. Well, at first I said, have you got any bites? And he said, well, yeah, I've seen some lookers, but I didn't see any money yet. And he very nonchalant. He said, well, think it over, let me know. And that's when I said, well, I think it was Saturday, and I said, well, if I go home and think about it all weekend, and in the meantime somebody else buys it, then I've wasted all that thinking. So I said, I'll take it. I didn't even think to ask him if he'd take less money. I'm not good at bargaining. At the time, TWA owned Hilton International, and the crew stayed there. And so when I would go to Italy, because of the language problem, the hotels all had operators, and they had phone booths. And you could go to that operator and tell her, I want to speak to somebody at Borani, and I want you to initiate the call and ask them if there's someone there who speaks English so that I can then communicate with them. So that's why I would stay at the high-end hotels, because I needed that sort of support. So this one trip, I came in and the clerk was very apologetic and said, well, I'm sorry, but there's a big trade show in town and all our rooms are booked and we just don't have a place. But she said, do you have a car? And I said, well, yeah, I have a rental car. And she said, well, I'll see if I can find you a place. So she made a couple calls, and then a little later she came with a card and said, if you go up there, they have a place for you. And I looked at the card, and it said Villa d'Este. And I had heard that name, but it sounded awful expensive to me, but I didn't care. So I went up to the Villa d'Este and checked in. I've said that I can't afford the best of everything in the world, but at least I can afford a drink at one of the best places. A drink won't break me. So I went in there to the bar, and they seated me at a table, and next to a gentleman and a lady. And I looked at him and I said, looks familiar. Turns out it was Alfred Hitchcock. And so I spent, an hour or so conversing with him, because I really liked his Alfred Hitchcock Presents shows, and a couple of them were my favorites that I mentioned. One of them he wrote, and the other one he directed, and so we discussed that. So we had a nice conversation. Again, something that would never have happened if I weren't involved with cars and Ferraris.